Shalom. Chag Sameach. One thing that I really love about learning Talmud is how a discussion of halakha, of Jewish law, will often be interrupted by stories of rabbis, other people. Sometimes these stories reinforce the legal decision that was just made. Sometimes, often more often than not, undercutting it. Sometimes going on a wild tangent. And my favorite Sukkot story in the Talmud is found, appropriately enough, in Tractate Sukkot 23a. And although it's only 27 Aramaic words, perhaps not really a story, more of a vignette. And it comes following a legal argument between Rabbi Akiva and Rabban Gamliel. Quote, one who establishes his sukkah on the top of a ship. Rabban Gamliel deems it invalid, and Rabbi Akiva deems it valid. And now the story. There once was an incident involving Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Akiva, who were coming on a ship. Rabbi Akiva arose and established a sukkah at the top of the ship. The next day, the wind blew and uprooted it. Rabban Gamliel said to him, Akiva, where's your sukkah? End of story. I love it. I love it because it just makes the rabbis so real, so human. I'd say it blows me away. There'll be a few more. Here we see a bit of Rabban Gamliel's personality. And when you combine these stories with other stories found in other sections, you really get to know these people as people. So after this brief discussion, the Gemara returns back to the legal matter. And according to Abaye, who's thinking about these issues a couple of generations later, what Rabban Gamliel and Akiva's disagreement is about how strong a sukkah needs to be in order for it to be kosher, for it to be valid. Everyone, Abaye says, would agree that a sukkah that cannot withstand a typical land wind is an unfit sukkah. And everyone would also agree that a sukkah that could withstand an abnormally strong wind on land would be kosher. The disagreement is a sukkah that can withstand a typical land wind, but not an abnormally strong one. Here, Rabban Gamliel is saying that a sukkah that cannot withstand that atypical strong wind, which happens to be a regular wind at sea, is not a kosher sukkah, while Rabbi Akiva would say it is. Or in other words, this type of sukkah that can't withstand abnormally strong land winds, for Rabban Gamliel just doesn't make the hut. Doesn't make the hut? No. You can't handle the booth. Okay. For a little more context, Rabbi Akiva and Rabban Gamliel were living in a critical moment in Jewish history. The period between the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans and the Bar Kokhba revolt and the Hadrianic persecutions that would follow, which would see Rabbi Akiva ultimately executed by the Romans. Rabban Gamliel was the leader of the rabbinic community in Yavna, succeeding Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the one who established the rabbinic academy there in Yavna after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. Gamliel was very concerned with keeping the Jewish people unified and strong. He led strictly. He did not tolerate dissent when he felt it would threaten that unity. So it makes sense in that context that he would be one who would require a sukkah to be able to withstand particularly strong winds. In a world where the Jewish people were threatened from so many outside forces, it is understandable to say that our rituals must be done in a way that they can withstand the strongest forces that could threaten to uproot them. If it can't do that, there's no point in even trying. So if you're on a boat during Sukkot and you can't build a strong enough sukkah, just don't. Rabban Gamliel didn't build a sukkah. Akiva, on the other hand, is willing to take a chance. Yes, a sukkah needs to be strong enough to withstand typical winds where we would typically find a sukkah. But we should not be so afraid of something atypical coming around that it prevents us from living our lives, it prevents us from doing our rituals, prevents us from celebrating our festivals. Even if a wind may come and blow it away, by building the sukkah on the ship, Rabbi Akiva was making a statement. There are lots of other places where we see Rabban Gamliel showing his rigidity in his attempts to preserve Judaism. One in particular was that he would not allow particular people to enter into the community of rabbinic scholars. When he was in charge, he had the following policy. Any student whose inside was not like his outside would not be allowed to enter the study hall. And he had guards placed at the entrance of the Beit Midrash to restrict entry. Eventually, this rigidity, this heavy-handed leadership style, led to a revolt, and he was deposed as leader. And we learn on that day, on the day he was deposed, the guards were dismissed, and anyone was granted entry. They added 400, and some say 700 benches to the study hall to accommodate everyone who had not been previously allowed in. Now, even if we disagree with it, we can perhaps understand Rabban Gamliel's more strict, more elitist position. For Judaism to remain strong, we cannot allow hypocrisy in our leadership, and the students need to prove that they are worthy to enter. But how can we really know if someone's insides match their outsides before we know them? The only way would be to judge their outsides. So the rabbis that deposed Gamliel, and Akiva was one of those rabbis involved, thought it better to take a chance, thought it better to be welcoming, thought it better to let people in, regardless of how they appeared or where they were exactly on their Jewish journey. They had some trust, they had some faith that the process would turn out okay. It may be risky, maybe riskier. Who knows what will happen with all these new people now engaged in our holy work? Will it look the same? Or will old ways of thinking be disrupted? Just as Rabbi Akiva thought it better to build the sukkah that might fall in particularly strong winds, these rabbis thought it better to admit everyone who wanted to come in, instead of making strict standards that only allowed a few. They took a chance on welcoming. Which I think brings us back to Sukkot. The holy days where we are supposed to welcome guests into our sukkah. This includes real live guests to share meals with, as well as symbolic guests who are not physically with us, but whose examples and values are inspirations for us today. The Ushpizim, the Ushpizot. And on today, the first day of Sukkot, we welcome in our first patriarch and matriarch, Abraham and Sarah. And they're the perfect first guests to invite because they are the exemplars of hospitality in our tradition, with their tent always open to welcome anyone who may be going by. One of the most famous examples of this is found at the beginning of Genesis 18. Adonai appeared to him, to Abraham, by the terebinths of Mamre. He was sitting at the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. Looking up, he saw 3 men standing near him. Perceiving this, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, bowing to the ground. He said, "My Lord, Adonai, if it please you, do not go past your servant." The verse is a little bit ambiguous. These verses are a little ambiguous about who Abraham is talking to right here. At first glance, it might seem that Abraham is talking to the 3 men. We only find out they're angels later. The JPS translation in our Chumashim even translates the word Adonai, which here is spelled out fully Aleph, Daled, Nun, Yud, so it's not necessarily God's name, as my lords, in the plural, instead of my Lord, which is grammatically possible. And the next verse continues Abraham's speech. Let a little water be brought. Bathe your feet. Recline under the tree. That is clearly addressed to the three men. But that first verse, there's some anomalies in the Hebrew. When Abraham says, my Lord, if it please you, do not go past your servant, he is speaking in the singular, referring to himself as Avdecha, your singular servant. However, in the next verse, he's speaking in the plural. He says, Raglechem, which I will translate very precisely as all y'all's feet. So some commentators will say that the first verse, he's addressing the leader of the three men, and in the second, he's addressing all of them. However, if we really get into the details, it becomes apparent that Abraham is shifting who he's talking to in these two verses. In the first verse, when he says Adonai, meaning my Lord, again, it's the actual word Adonai spelled out. When he says that, he's saying a word that could refer to God, or it could refer to human beings. But there's a subtle difference in vowels that can help us know which one it is. When Adonai is spelled with a kamatz under the nun, as it is in this story, it is always referring to God. When Lot encounters these same men that Abraham greets in the next chapter, when he greets them, he also refers to them as Adonai, but the vowel under the nun is a patach. So it's the difference between a kamatz and a patach. It's just a vowel like this or a vowel like this. It is pronounced basically the same, but the meaning changes. Lot is using the term to address human beings, and Abraham was using the term to address God. So to make it clear, God appears to Abraham. Abraham then sees three people. He breaks off his meeting with God and runs out to greet people, and then says to God, Adonai, my Lord, if it please you, do not go on past your servant. He then goes on to take care of the needs of these three strangers, who appeared to Abraham as three regular human beings. So from this story, Rav concludes in Shabbat 127a that Haknasat Orchim, providing hospitality to guests, is more important than greeting the face of the Shekhinah, the divine presence. I think that's a radical thing for a religion to be saying, so I'll say it again. It is more important to be welcoming to our fellow human beings than to be in direct communion with God. One of the earliest collections of Hasidic writings, the Me'or Einayim, which was written by the first Chernobyl Rebbe, Menachem Nahum Tversky, a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, and Magid of Mezrich, has an important observation on this story. He asks, if God's presence is everywhere, as it says in Isaiah 6:3, all the earth is full of God's glory, why would Abraham need to ask God not to depart from him? And further, the welcoming of guests is a mitzvah. And when we do a mitzvah, we connect with God. So shouldn't Abraham be doubly assured that God will not depart from him? Because A, God is everywhere, and B, Abraham is about to do a really important mitzvah of welcoming guests, and God connects with people who are performing mitzvot. The Me'or Einayim answers this question by saying that at the beginning of this story, God has appeared to Abraham in certainty. Abraham was, as it were, face to face with the Shekhinah. He was in a state of religious ecstasy, beholding the divine. And even though God is everywhere, we do not always feel it. And even though mitzvot are supposed to connect us with God, sometimes they don't. So Abraham, in turning from God to welcome these three guests, has no guarantee No guarantee that he would still be able to feel God's presence after. But despite this risk, he turned away from God and towards people, making sure they felt welcomed in his home. He doesn't even begin to address God with his prayer not to depart from him until he's already gotten up, running to greet these strangers. He doesn't say, "Excuse me, God," and then go. He starts going, and then he says, "Oh, excuse me, God." So Abraham left the assurances of being in the presence of God. He left the assurances to be sure that he could take care of others. Which brings us back to Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Akiva and the Sukkot. Because Rabban Gamliel is a person who needs assurances. He needs his sukkah to survive exceptionally strong winds. And so there are situations where he doesn't even bother to make one. He needs to know his students will be good, so he sets very high entry requirements. Rabbi Akiva takes chances. He builds his sukkah even if the next day it may blow down. He and the other rabbis in the academy thought it was more important to make Judaism accessible, even if that meant having to deal with more people, their flaws, their foibles, their tendencies to annoy us, distract us. So too, we take chances when we welcome people into our community. And we should strive to do this even at moments where our connection with the divine might be interrupted. Because as Avraham Avinu, who we've invited into our sukkah today, he's teaching us that it's more important to make our fellows feel welcome than to greet the face of the Shekhinah. So it's my prayer that we can take this value to heart. That we not let the dangers around us, or the fears, make us feel we need to harden the walls of our hearts as Rabban Gamliel hardened the walls of his sukkah. That we don't let our encounters with God narrow our vision to others around us, but rather let it, like it did for Abraham, lift up our eyes. Keep our vision wide so we can see fellow human beings and rush to welcome them into our tent. Shabbat Shalom. Hag Sameach. And as a meditation right before Musaf to take this teaching to heart, I'll invite you to close your eyes, sit comfortably, feet on the ground. And as I said in my Rosh Hashanah sermon, prayer is supposed to connect us to that divine, to God, which I defined in that moment as the source of all that is good and true, everything worthy of service and worship, all those values that you hold. So I want you at this moment to imagine yourself at the entrance of your house. Your door is open, and you're sitting at the entrance of your house. And you are before that source. All those values that you hold dear, truth, freedom, justice, whatever it is for you, those values, love, all of those values are being manifest immediately in front of you, and you are in connection with it. With God. What does that feel like? What does that feel like? And be in that moment. God is appearing in front of you as you sit at the entrance of your house. And now, as you look outside of your house, you see 3 people walk by. Maybe they're people you know. Maybe they're friends. Maybe they're people you just know. Maybe they're strangers. And I want you to think, what would it feel like to turn from that feeling of God, to stand up, to run out to these 3 people, and to invite them into your home. And we pray that that connection with God will not be disrupted, but maybe it will. Maybe it will. When you're ready, you may open your eyes.